So, Brian, take me back to day one where you decided to focus on Miles Morales for a complete game.
Brian Intihar talked to me a lot about how he introduced Miles into the first game with the concept of really fleshing out his origin story, starting with Marvel Spider-Man. And we knew it was essential for us to make a standalone game for Miles based on the foundation we laid in that game. So we had a lot of conversations figuring out what it is that we wanted Miles to do. And ultimately, we decided it was going to be a story about his growth and his journey to become a hero. And that was really what our day one conversation was. It was a simple idea, but how do we make Miles feel unique and special and really have ownership of being his own Spider-Man?
And did those early talks influence kind of the direction that the City That Never Sleeps DLC went in?
City That Never Sleeps was part of that conversation. We knew that Miles was going to continue from the end of Marvel Spider-Man through the City Never Sleeps and then into Miles Morales. So we put breadcrumbs all throughout the city that City Never Sleeps to ensure it set us up well for the story we were going to tell. And that was what was really exciting is as that was being developed and we were figuring out our story, we could actually inform some ideas and concepts for the CTNS content.
And it almost seemed like his training unfolded through those phone conversations that he had in City That Never Sleeps. Like you got some of those beats from Miles of web swinging and stuff like that for the first time.
Yeah, the thing that was great about this is we wanted to have that year one feel with our game, but we didn't want to go through a lot of the year one, growing pains in our game in our gameplay. So by putting that off screen in some of the conversations was a really good way to let you know that that was happening, but we weren't necessarily seeing it in media res.
This is a new take on Miles's origin story. Can you go into that a little bit? Kind of how Insomniac is shaping it as their own?
So we always start with the foundation of the comics. What Brian Michael Bendis did and Sarah Pichelli with the original comics was the Rosetta Stone that we started with. And what we knew about him is that he was a smart kid. He had these amazing parents with Jefferson Davis and Rio, and and his best friend Genki Lee. That was sort of the kernel that we started with, and saying, how do we preserve that feeling of that familial structure that is core to Miles' background? Like family is a big part of who he is, and his friends are a big part of who he is. So really, we crafted our story around that. But from that, we really took liberties, and we had the license to take liberties from our partners at Marvel Games to say, hey, let's be bold. How can we tell a story that's not only a great Miles Morales story, but a great Miles Morales story in the Insomniac universe? And one of the big things that we changed was Jefferson Davis dies in Marvel Spider-Man. That is not the same that's in the comics, and that had a ripple for everything we were going to do in our story. Now the story is not about that, but it informs who Miles is, and that does sort of send him on a different path than what you would have seen in the comics.
And Miles is a year into being a Spider-Man, right? Or not even a hero yet, right? Like he's just kind of learning the ropes. We see a big beat at the beginning of this game where he develops a new power. Can you kind of talk about that moment a little bit?
Yeah, we wanted to make sure Miles' powers were none of the Miles' iconic powers manifested off screen. That's something we wanted to see. So we knew he was going to be getting used to being a web slinger. He wasn't going to have the same prowess as Peter Parker, but we knew he was going to at least be at a place where he could swing and he could do the combat and basically a lot of the same functions that Peter has. So what we wanted to do was create these emotional moments, these moments that sort of forces Miles to change. Because we really see this as a coming of age story, and he's going to grow as a character. And this is one of those seminal moments where Peter is on his back foot. He's having a hard time, and he's down. And Rhino has got him on the ropes. And Miles just has to summon something from within to protect his mentor. And that's when the bioelectricity surges through his body. And then we have this really iconic punch that Miles lands on Rhino, and that changes his trajectory of becoming his own Spider-Man.
Now, Peter, a man of science, obviously would find this fascinating. Do you kind of go into that in the story of after he lands this punch, them exploring these powers?
Yeah, the thing that's great is we we knew that they're both science nerds, right? So the first thing he says, let's do some science tests, Pete, tomorrow. It's gonna be great, right? And Pete's like, I got something to tell you, right? And then he drops some news on Miles that he is going to join MJ in Symkaria for a couple of weeks. And he's going to dust off his photo skills and be her sidekick photographer for these peace talks. So he can't geek out with Miles over his powers, but what Pete can do and does do as a foundation leading up to this moment that he knows he's going to leave is he sets up these wonderful training challenges all throughout the city that allows him to have a communication with Miles and to keep training him even though he's not there.
So even though Peter Parker is elsewhere, he and Miles will still be in contact with each other.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is Peter trusts Miles, and that scene where they basically say their goodbyes, Pete bestows with him a gift that he's like, you've earned this, right? And this gift is sort of the promise of you are ready to be a Spider-Man. And what Miles has to learn is, I have the suit, but what does it really mean to be a hero? And that's what our journey's about. He has skills, he has the powers, but he has to figure out what his version of that mantle really means to him.
And Peter really sets the stage for him, saying, "You are New York City's only Spider-Man," as he departs, which freaks Miles out.
Yeah.
Can you kind of talk about the conflict that Miles is going to confront here with Peter out of the picture?
Well, ultimately, he feels the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. He understands what it means. For the past year, he's had training wheels on, right? He's been with Peter. He's done stuff with Peter. The Rhino encounter was his big test in a way, if you think about it, like is a graduation test before he goes on. But now he's on his own. Like, he really doesn't have Peter to lean on specifically in present, around, with him. So that is his challenge: is how can I do this alone? And will I need Peter's support? And the thing that we loved was bringing Genki more central to the story and how he's going to help Miles figure out his path. That was a way for Miles to bounce off these problems and challenges he's going to confront all throughout the story. And Genki helps him on many fronts.
Is it kind of a buddy's tale of these two together most of the time, or is this more Miles' story with Genki aiding him when he can?
I think it's Miles' story. We wanted to make sure the cast of characters that complement Miles were going to really flesh out that support system in a way. Rio Morales, his mother, is running for city council, but also is a loving mother. But the tension in his life personally is, he's moved from Brooklyn, his home, to Harlem, which was her childhood home. So he's got this personal stress that he's dealing with, but he's trying to find his way there. So just like he's trying to find his way as a Spider-Man, he's trying to find his way in his new home of Harlem. And Genki's there, and he actually is from Harlem, and he's going to show him the ropes and talk about why Harlem is such an amazing place. And he's going to help them technically. And we can get into that a little bit if you want as well.
Sure.
We wanted to make sure Genki wasn't just present for story moments, that he was going to have a true gameplay impact. And we were looking at our systems and thinking about ways that we could improve the engagement with the open world. And we came up with the idea of this app that people all around New York, they could talk, crimes, they could report anything that's going on. And Spider-Man will have a quick way to interface directly with the people of New York City. Who better than Genki Lee to be the author of this app? And him being a coder and him making games, it made perfect sense when he got the suit from Peter. Like, hey, I think I can interface my app into this suit and we could do something really special. So that really is how Genki makes an important impact in Miles' journey to become a hero, is by letting him have an in to the people of New York and specifically Harlem.
Jumping all the way back to kind of the beginning of the project, you joined Insomniac kind of when they were shipping the first Spider-Man. Is that correct?
Yeah, it was the winter right before the winter of 2017. So it was am I right on the dates? Yeah, 2017. So I was there. I was on the project for roughly 6 months.
And then did you join kind of with the understanding of like, hey, we're going to spin this off and do something else, and like you're going to head that up, or was that something that came around, after the fact?
It came around after. I think Insomniac has always been a company I've been interested in. I have a lot of friends who I worked with back in the days at Disney Interactive 25 years ago who work at Insomniac Games. So I've kept in touch with them. I went to college with Chad DeZern. So, I know a lot of people at Insomniac, and there was just an opportunity where I was like, hey, I love what you guys are doing. I saw the Spider-Man trailer and I was blown away. I'm like, how do I get a part of this? How do I get into the studio? So I had some conversations, and it turned out where they had an opportunity for me to help out with that game, and it was a blessing. And from there, it just sort of organically happened where we had conversations as Spider-Man was wrapping up. Hey, would you like to work on the Miles Morales game? And I was like, absolutely. This character is amazing.
From what we've seen of Harlem, it looks beautiful, and I guess I don't remember Harlem like that in the first game. So what have you guys done to this? Have you expanded it? Have you detailed it? Like, what have you done to this area of New York? And then is all of New York from the first game still in this?
To answer your last question first, all of Manhattan is in Marvel Spider-Man Miles Morales. But what we did is put a lot more detail and richness into Harlem, and East Harlem specifically. And that is going to be a blend of the Puerto Rican culture, and it's a multicultural area within Harlem. And it was a wonderful opportunity because it was present in the first game. It just didn't have the level of care and development because we didn't have as much content in that space. So it was just a wonderful opportunity to dive in and just hyper detail that space. We did some research trips to Harlem to really make sure that we got it right. The murals, the details of set dressing, the feeling, to really understand the culture. We actually talked to Sony about doing tests or having conversations with people that live there and talk about their life and their experiences and make sure that all the nuances were done correctly. So I would like to say that Harlem, is probably one of the most important characters in our game, because it really has a pulse, and it's the heart. It's what Miles is fighting for, right? And that's ultimately what we decided was Harlem and the people he loves is the heart and soul of this game.
I'm always fascinated by those research trips like you talked about. Was there anything specific in your trip that you remember experiencing or seeing when you were in Harlem that you're like, we've got to put this in the game?
The one thing that struck me is all the amazing murals that are everywhere within East Harlem. Gorgeous, colorful murals that speak to culture, that speak to just the artistic spirit of that area. So that's the one thing that really struck me. In addition, just to the people that I saw on the streets, but ultimately the neighborhood itself just had a warmth that we wanted to make sure came across in our game.
And you're using a lot of neon noir aesthetics through this.
I had early conversations with Jason Hickey and Gavin Goulden around our two art directors, how we could make this game have an identity. And the two things we came up with was, well, let's set this in the winter season, right? Let's make a seasonal shift that's really going to transform all of Manhattan. And the second was neon noir. It's like we wanted to bring more color into the game. And part of that was just influence, like, okay, we want to make Miles have his own style. And that neon noir aesthetic felt like a great way to sort of reflect the youthful, aspirational quality of that character. In the music and the color and the murals, all of that sort of helps to define what we felt was an aesthetic that we could wrap around the whole project.
And in setting it during the winter, though, then you kind of have, it's not a clashing, but Christmas is everywhere. So on top of of these vibrant murals and stuff, you're seeing Christmas trees and all that. Can you kind of talk about the seasonal shift too?
What we wanted to make sure is it wasn't just Christmas, right? It really represents all the celebrations around the holiday. So you'll hear people talking about Kwanzaa. You hear people talking about Hanukkah. You'll hear the idea of the city is celebrating this time of year, and we wanted to have that wonderful, like, I don't know if you've ever been to New York during the winter, but it really is the best time of year. It's truly magical. And I had the opportunity to go to New York during winter, and it just, when you look at the stores and you feel the music, and it instantly sort of contributes to the color that we were hoping to get in the game just by the nature of all the decorations. So it was a perfect marriage of celebrating a holiday against a potential terrible tragedy that Miles had to solve. It was that mix of those two that we found was really cool.
Outside of aesthetics and kind of the overall look of the game, is winter going to affect gameplay at all? Are we going to be slipping and sliding around on the streets of New York?
Yeah, we had a lot of conversations about, do we want to have a gameplay impact from the winter season? And what we came down to is we want to have that reliability of when you do something, you're going to get what you want, right? So we decided against a lot of the augmentation or like slipping on snow or any of that stuff, because we wanted that seamless, uninterrupted flow that was just magical in the first Spider-Man game. But what we do have, which is awesome, is you have the kick up of snow every time he does a point launch, or he's going on the street. You can see every individual footprint get revealed. So it really has a level of immersion that we can get. I do want to call out our sound department, because the sound, it's a huge city. You can hear the difference in footsteps from when he's on snow to slush to just wet concrete. And that just brought another level to the overall soundscape.
I want to go back to Genki a little bit. In the first game, you could play as Mary Jane and Miles. Is Genki a playable character? Or will there be other, and if you don't want to reveal that, will there be other characters you play as in this?
No, we are Miles 100% of the time. And that was a choice we made, is we wanted to focus on the two parts of Miles. Miles as a kid, as a non-hero. So we have sequences that you saw on the bridge demo where he's walking through the streets. And then we have, of course, all of his superhero stuffs. But really focusing on Miles allowed us to put maximum effort into delivering the best Miles experience we could.
For part of the reason that I'm sure you guys did that in the last game was to help break up the pace of the game. Like you're playing as Spider-Man, then you're playing as Mary Jane, which is a different type of feel.
Yep.
So with this game, since you're Miles most of the time, how have you approached the pacing of the game and helped sort of break up those high intense moments with the more low key stuff?
So one of the things that we loved about the first Marvel's Spider-Man game was it did have a wonderful sense of pacing, and we didn't want to lose that, right? So we need to complement the high moments with lower moments or investigations. Those are the things I absolutely loved in the first game. Is like, hey, I have a mystery to solve. I have to figure something out. I have to go really look into these locations and try to uncover a truth. So there's that as a lever that we were able to use. And then of course it was just having moments of gameplay where you're in Miles' shoes without the costume on, and just environmental storytelling and just focusing on that. Miles getting to know his neighborhood was essential. And the thing that's wonderful in this game is, for people who've never been to New York or never seen Harlem, as Miles is getting to know Harlem, they're getting to know Harlem. So you have that player, protagonist parody that we think is really kind of magical. So that's how we sort of approached it, is making sure that the game isn't at 11 at all times, really making sure the pacing goes up and down, but focusing that through the Miles lens.
And getting to know Harlem in what we've seen so far, it seems like you guys are really focused on representation. I think that's one of the main things I've seen online, is people were psyched to see the Puerto Rican flag and Spanish speaking going on in these neighborhoods. What did you guys do internally to ensure that the right people in Insomniac were working on this, and that you guys were getting this out as authentic as possible?
It was essential for us. The first thing we did in the first days of us developing the story is we knew we wanted to have consultants. And Brian Horton came to me and says, hey, I think you should contact this guy, Evan Narcisse. I think he's going to make a big impact on your game. And Evan instantly got, when we had the first conversation, the first question I asked him is like, Evan, tell me about Miles Morales. What is it that you like about him? And he says, you know what? Miles is just cool. He's just the coolest character, and he feels like a Spider-Man of today. I said, he even told me, he said, Brian, I saw Miles Morales. I was that kid, right? He related to Miles in a personal way, and we knew we needed that kind of authenticity thinking about Miles Morales. But that wasn't enough, right? We really knew that there was multiple sides to this equation. We needed the Puerto Rican consultant. So we had brought our content to Harlem, had people look at it, and then we had a wonderful critique of saying, hey, this stuff doesn't quite feel right. This set dressing doesn't feel authentic. This interaction between Miles and Rio doesn't feel right. So then we hired a consultant to ensure that the Puerto Rican Spanish was spoken correctly, and the exchanges were respectful and culturally correct, and the set dressing in the world felt authentic. So it really was all fronts ensuring that the look, the way people sound, everything that we did in the game was going through the lens of authenticity. And if we didn't have that internal to our team, which we did, we had people that we bring in from the team with different perspectives, we would look outside and say, let's bring in additional voices.
Do you guys feel like you really distilled down what makes Miles a hero. And by that I don't mean like just the powers, right? Like,
Yeah.
because he has good powers, but like what is it at his core that makes him a hero?
At his core, we always try to think about, and sometimes you have to go to the end, like you go through a whole journey trying to figure out what this is, because it's the simplest thing in the world, but you sometimes go through a lot of iteration to get there. But it really did boil down to Miles fights to protect the people he loves, right? And that was sort of the one of our center pillars that became the defining North Star for everything Miles would do. And that included, obviously his mother, that included Genki, but it also, the people of Harlem that he got to meet, he, fell in love with Harlem. So that was the defining thing. It's like when Miles already had the heart of a hero, but I think what we see in this journey is that manifest to him understanding why, right? Him having a feeling like this is something I'm supposed to do, and I know why I'm doing it.
And Miles is really into music. Can you go into that a little? The role that music and sound will play in his life?
We were thinking about ways that we could give Miles an angle that was unique. We looked at the comics and we knew science was a big part of his backstory, but Peter Parker loves science and has that background. So we wanted something that just felt a little different than what we've seen, Peter might have as a hobby or an interest. And we had conversations with Evan and our team, and we said, well, what if he liked making music? What if he liked making beats? And we're like, oh, that sounds cool. And then we started doing some research on that, and we actually started thinking about ways that we can make that more integrated into the gameplay experience and how that influenced how our soundtrack sounded. So we have John Paisano, who is the amazing composer of Marvel Spider-Man, but we wanted to do what I called orchestral synth hop, right? Which is a sort of a blend of these three things that came together to create a new type of soundtrack that felt Marvel, but also felt unique to Miles, right? So it is that hybrid of those disparate elements that came together that gave us this remix in a way of the Spider-Man soundtrack sound, which I just couldn't be more excited about. And I've heard a lot of people commenting that this music really is resonating with them, which warmed our hearts.
Does his love of music affect the gameplay?
There is going to be an open world collectible around sound and collecting sounds. I don't want to go into a lot of details about that right now, but we did try to find ways that it has that his hobby, his interest is woven into the gameplay experience. But as far as the dynamic score, what you will hear is different elements of our soundtrack being sculpted as you go through from an exploration to a stealth section into combat. But when you jump off of a building, all of those things are sort of sculpted to sound like it's being orchestrated instead of it just playing one piece of music all the way through.
And in that same vein, depending on who you ask, New York is one of the birthplaces of hip hop, and and that's awesome that you guys are working with the score in that way. But are you guys doing anything licensed with the music? Like, am I going to be swinging to Nas or like Run DMC, like anything like that?
Well, first, I just want to call out Boy Wonder, who is the artist that was able to do the beats that worked with. He worked with John Paisano to sort of come up with this fusion sound, right? So it's really having once again multiple influences. Like, hey, we want to bring people in to help make this more authentic. But when we talked about licensed music, we did want to have licensed music in the game, and the track you guys heard in the first mission was Jaden Smith's track with Kid Cudi. And it's absolutely amazing. And we have a few other tracks that we've licensed, as well as original tracks in the game. Like the first song you hear at the top of the game is an original piece of music that we created. So there's a number of true hit songs, I think, that we have peppered out throughout the game. And I can't wait for you guys to hear the original tracks we have from Boy Wonder and Lecrae. I mean, they are absolutely amazing.
With every hero, there's a villain in these stories. Can you go into Roxxon and the underground and the conflict that Miles is going to face right out of the gates here?
Yeah. So besides, Miles becoming his own Spider-Man, a lot of that comes down to what are the things that are challenging him? What does he have? What are the obstacles he has to overcome? And this war breaking out in Harlem is predicated on the fact that Roxxon has moved in, set up this gigantic new generator, which is powered by Nuform, and it's supposedly this clean energy source. And it's something that doesn't sit well with a lot of the people of Harlem, and especially Rio Morales. She runs for city council to try to resist Roxxon's presence in Harlem, and how they're almost stripping away some of the culture that's there, and they don't know what this new form's all about. So it's kind of scary. What we find is there is the conflict. The conflict expands when the underground start actively disrupting Roxxon's operations, and they steal a canister of Nuform. And that is the central conflict, is this dangerous new energy source, which we saw in the bridge mission, that is stolen. Miles' power interacts with it. It actually was explosive. It took a whole bridge down. So we have these two forces, Roxxon and the underground, clashing, and Harlem is in the middle. And that's really what Miles is trying to protect, is how do I deal with both of these forces? To give you a little bit of background on Roxxon, Roxxon is a classic Marvel company. They're an energy company. We've introduced Simon Krieger, who is a character from Marvel lore, that is the director of the Nuform project, and he is really sort of that side of the equation. And then we have the Tinkerer, who is this amazing inventor of weapons, and she's invented this technology called programmable matter that can transform matter into any shape, and we turn those into weapons. So it's those two forces that we think really will put pressure on Miles, and it will be the catalyst that gets him to change and evolve throughout the game.
For clarifying purposes, Roxxon and the Tinkerer are also opposed to each other. Am I understanding that correctly?
That is correct. So in our demo, we show how they've disrupted the rally, specifically a call out to Roxxon that they're coming after them, and they are going to steal this Nuform. And we don't know why. I mean, it's a mystery. Like that, we don't understand their motivations, but we do know that there is a conflict between these two organizations. Now, Underground is a crime organization. We call them the Young Mafia. After the inner demons were taken out, and the Magia is down, there's a power vacuum. Fisk is out of the equation, so there's power vacuum. The Underground are rising to the front as the criminal organization trying to take over. They're younger, they're more technology based, and they see this Nuform opportunity as a way to gain more power.
The Tinkerer in Marvel Comics has had several forms, including a really old man. This seems to be a very different take on that.
Yeah, what makes her Tink?
The Tinkerer is one of the oldest Spider-Man villains. He goes back really far into the earliest comics. At his core, he's always been an inventor of weapons for others. He's never gotten into the middle of the fight. It's more he's a supplier. What we wanted to do is update the Tinkerer for today and make the Tinkerer more of a presence that we could put at the front lines, not just in the background. So making the Tinkerer a leader of this criminal organization, the Underground, seemed like a way that we can really evolve who the Tinkerer was and who the Underground are as a crime faction in Marvel's New York City. So that was the big change, is modernizing the Tinkerer, bringing that character to the front lines, and really showcasing technology that we think is more futuristic with this dynamic programmable matter. Those were the big thoughts that we had.
It seems like you thought a lot about color too, like Roxxon is red, the Underground's purple, which happens to be the same color as the Prowler, an iconic character in Miles's life. What are your thoughts on the Prowler?
Prowler's super cool. It's a great character.
Love it. So we've seen Tinkerer, we've seen Rhino, and one of the draws of the first game was we had a huge rogues gallery of some of the most iconic Spider-Man villains. Maybe not saying specifically who's in it, but like, is that something that's going to carry over to this game, or are you going to focus more specifically on like Miles villains? Like, how are you guys going to walk that balance?
Yeah, so the Miles comics are roughly, they're coming up to 10 years, now of comics. And the Rogues Gallery for Miles specifically is much smaller than for Peter Parker. So as you guys saw, we did bring Rhino back in. And I'll just make a note about Rhino. What was really compelling to us is, if you think of Marvel Spider-Man as the first story, the first chapter of Miles' origin story, there's this iconic mission. Sorry, small spoilers for people, that were, Miles and Rhino have an encounter, sort of a kind of a scary stealth section with Rhino. So we thought it was really interesting if we can bring Rhino back into our game, but through the idea that now he's a Spider-Man, and what would that be like? He almost can get a little bit of revenge. So we really enjoyed bringing Rhino back for that. But when you think about Miles Rogue's Gallery, it is not as deep, but we wanted to make sure our story was centered around conflicts that were nice and clear, characters that we could tell arcs on both the hero and the villain side. And that meant a smaller roster, right? Like, I think a focused roster in this game where Miles is on his coming of age journey, it felt like the best way to complement the story we were trying to tell.
Now, you've created some new characters around Miles, like Haley, who we got a little taste of in the early moments of the game. What about villains? Is that something that you're creating new antagonists as well?
I would say that if you look at the interpretations we have of Underground and Roxxon and the Tinkerer specifically, they feel like a refreshed version of classic villains. I would say everything we've done is to try to look at our lore and mine that lore, and then find ways to put the Insomniac twist on it. So I would say there are no completely unique to us villains, but there are villains that you'd recognize now, sort of respun through the Insomniac perspective.
Jumping back to that Rhino fight at the beginning of the game is just a big spectacle. Like, it's pretty spectacular, like, no pun intended, but like, it's just like putting stuff like that together. Are you guys trying to outdo yourself from the last game? Because that game is also full of a big spectacle. Like, do you feel like you've reached a point where it's like even bigger this time?
I think the wonderful thing about Insomniac Games is we never rest in our success, right? So Marvel Spider-Man is an amazing game. We all love it. I mean, people are still playing it today. It's incredible. But we knew there are areas that we could improve upon. And one of them was trying to get more of a seamless cinematic experience, an immersive cinematic experience that flowed very naturally from gameplay into cinematic moments back into gameplay again. So that was one of our core pillars, is how do we take our set piece moments and make them even more spectacular by removing any rough edges in them and bringing the peaks higher, right? So whenever we are doing an activity, like for instance on the bridge, I'm doing what is you would consider maybe a QTE, but I have to web up a bus, right? But I'm using my web shooter. So it is a systemic move, just presented in a more exotic way. So we try to make sure any of our more exotic sequences felt like actual gameplay with the buttons that you would use in normal gameplay. So that was one of our big focuses. The other thing I would say is we wanted to make sure that connection between missions and the open world, there was no loading screens, right? So that was a foundational difference that we just had to really be careful in how we constructed our missions to make sure that you never see a loading screen. So those things, in addition to the spectacle missions being better, just smoothing out those transitions has made the game feel, like, yeah, we're trying to one up ourselves, to answer your question. And it's something that we will continue to build as we move forward.
Now, you say no loading screens. That's for the PlayStation 5 version. The PlayStation 4 version, you still have the subway loads. I don't know what you call those, but can you tell me about some more differences between the two systems that players can expect to see?
The PlayStation 5 one, we were just able to take full advantage of all the features in the PlayStation 5. And one of those things was graphics fidelity. So you're going to see ray trace reflections everywhere in the game on the PlayStation 5. That is not something we're going to feature on the 4. The haptic controller is going to have a next level of immersion, that there will be a rumble on the 4, but the haptics really allow bioelectricity to travel from one side of the controller to the other. It makes the web swings feel that much more visceral when there's resistance on the trigger, as you feel the connection of a web and the tension as you swing through. So we have those wonderful features. The SSD obviously allows us to have, if you die or if you're wanting to fast travel, near instant load. So just fade down, fade up. You're going to keep playing the game. So we have no loading screens. In the PS4, we would have loading screens on those fast travels or deaths. So those are fundamentally some of the differences between the two systems. I would say, as a gameplay experience, they should feel in parity. Like, it's not going to make one game doesn't feel much different than the other. But those enhancements that we're talking about really add up to make it feel like this is the definitive Spider-Man experience on PlayStation 5. And the 4 feels great. It looks pretty, but it really is a binary difference when you play the 5.
That's a good way to end it.